Welcome again to my tutorial series on the question of whether or not Creoles are a distinct kind of language, or more to the point, do linguists, as opposed to historians and anthropologists, have any reason to be interested in these languages? Today's lesson is our fourth one. I want to address a proposition that you may often have heard, that it's been disproven that Creoles come from Pidgins. As I've said, we've always thought in the past that there was a relationship between Pidgins and Creoles, and that this meant that most Creoles, if not all of them, had pidgin precursors, even if there weren't official records of those pidgins. But the Uniformitarians claim that that isn't true, and are given to saying that it's been disproven that most of the world's Creoles came from Pidgins. Is that true? Let's look at how that debate has actually played out beyond the eyes of most of you. Now, I want to make it clear that by pidginization, for one, I don't mean that the pidgin would have to have been a long-lasting one with gelled structure. I just mean that there was a break in transmission down to the level of structure that we typically associate with pidginization in the classic extreme sense exemplified by, for example, Russonorsk or Chinook jargon. Not all of the languages which often for folk terminological or chance reasons happen to be called pidgins. But many may prefer break in transmission or basic variety a la Klein and Purdue or extensive second language acquisition. I think all of us are talking about the same thing. If I say pidginization, I am referring to this general phenomenon. So, it's been shown that Creoles don't come from pidgins. You will hear that at conferences, in conversations and exchanges, but the truth is it has not been shown. And so, for example, as I've tried to show in this series, the Pollen-Caro challenge, which has been unanswered by Uniformitarians, shows that Creoles are not just combinations of their features. If that were true, then the pidgin argument would be dead in the water, but it isn't true. Or the Creole prototype hypothesis, which has been unaddressed in any constructive way by Uniformitarians, as I argued before, shows that creolization can yield a unique structural configuration that's predictable of pidgin birth. 3. These propositions are not invalidated and not being couched in generative syntactic terms. So the idea can't be that it's been shown that Creoles don't come from pidgins because I haven't been writing about head movement and neither have other Creole exceptionalists. That's just bad science. So, if the Pollen-Caro challenge is unanswered and the Creole prototype is unaddressed by the usual suspects, and people like me are not wrong in not referring to AG or OP, then what's some other proof? Has it really been proven? What's some other proof that Creoles don't come from pidgins? The Uniformitarians have some points that they might refer to, but they don't hold up. So, often, for example, you'll hear from them that there's no documentation of pidgin stages of plantation Creoles like Sranan or Haitian. And yes, that's true, but all of science is not done on the basis of concrete documents sitting right under our eyes. Here's a picture of Icaronicterus. That is the very first bat fossil that we have. And as you see, it's a bat. It's got some features that primitive bat specialists would recognize as early bat, but it's a bat. There is no fossil of something that's intermediate between some mouse-like creature and a bat like this one that has arms that are half arms and half wings. It doesn't exist. Icaronicterus looks like this. That's a reconstruction of it. It was a bat. However, we deduce that this creature, this bat, early bats, evolved from something that was not a bat because of the deductive reasoning that we use in looking at what all mammals have in common, in comparing bats to various sequences of fossils that are available to us of other animals where you have the procession documented more exhaustively. So that's the kind of reasoning that we're using in saying that plantation Creoles had pidgin precursors, because there are various cases where documented pidgins turned into Creoles, such as Tok-Pisin and Bi-Slamal on Solomon Islands Pidgin, such as Hawaiian Creole English, such as Sango in Africa, such as Chinook jargon, which creolized. Because of those, we're saying that there's reason to think that other Creoles had the same, yes, I'm going to say it, life cycle. So the fact that nobody was really writing much of anything down on a small farm in Suriname in the 1650s is not disproof. That's frankly very primitive reasoning. So, how about this? A Creole exceptionalist says that Creoles have pidgin features. This is an important argument which we've made in a great many ways, and this time in more than one language over the past 20 years. You can see in Creoles not just the prototype features, but in general traits that suggest that between their source languages and them was a major break in transmission. So here is a Sranang sentence. I am buying the house. Me e buy a also. Innocent sentence, it tells us a lot. So, the first person singular pronoun in both English and Fongbe, the substrate language here in Niger-Congo language, varies for case. I and me, same thing in the substrate language. But Sranang's is case invariant. That's typical of pidgins. English and Fongbe have definite articles, both of them. Fongbe is an analytic Niger-Congo language, but don't let that fool you. It has definite articles. Sranang has a definite article, this a, but that's grammaticalized from what began as dati, that. In other words, it emerged without a definite article like a pidgin. The progressive is marked with both a verb and a post-verbal suffix / clitic in English and in Fongbe. Am, by, ing works the same way in Fongbe, but in Sranang it doesn't. You just have one pre-verbal marker as in a pidgin. Just to be sure, I'm showing you the Fongbe construction. See that we at the end there. Sranang didn't do this. It's because Sranang began as a pidgin / basic variety / break in transmission / extensive second language acquisition. Or Sranang's lexicon is founded on a mere 650 English words. In other words, a pidgin level lexicon. So these are the reasons that Creole exceptionalism proposes that Creole languages are based on a break in transmission. These are the clues that these languages were born in the same way as Tok-Pisin. Now, it wouldn't be fair of me to say, this time, that Uniformitarians have not responded to this point, because in Abo and de Graaf especially, the new paper getting around, they actually do, but frankly they only dance around it. So for example, they say, how do we determine synchronically whether an infinitive has been generalized? And what they're referring to is that in French, if you say that parler, to speak, has been generalized in the French Creoles, well, maybe the fact that that form is also the second person plural present and others suggest that I might be oversimplifying and assuming that it's the infinitive. But, to be honest, I have written about this often. I have printed my responses to this often, and there are other lexifiers where you can be absolutely sure that it's the infinitive that has been generalized, and therefore by Occam's razor we can assume that that's what went on in French as well. Now Abo and de Graaf don't address that at all. As always, they address all of this very much in passing. Or, for example, they say, if we define infinitive as a least inflected form of the verb, and copula as an overt linking morpheme between certain nonverbal predicates, Vietnamese would qualify as a quasi-pidgin. So what they're saying is that the pidgin features that I and others have listed are also found in older languages that show no signs of being pidgins or creoles, and therefore that deep sixes the whole argument. So Vietnamese has zero copula, Vietnamese has non-variant verb roots. But I think most of you will understand that this is extremely messy argumentation. The issue is the difference between a variety and one from which it's descended. Of course, there are no features exclusive to pidgins. Straw man argumentation, their paper is called a null hypothesis of Creole origins, and this straw man argumentation is a null business indeed. 3. It's said that it's been disproven that Creoles come from pidgins. But that's a little odd if Creoles and the Creoles that we know came from pidgins, which are often called expanded pidgins, which is a really silly kind of terminology, but that's a whole other subject, are the same thing. So, as I showed you in another lecture, but it really is worth review, here's Sranang. And so, I was going, me, ben, a, go. So, the invariant subject pronoun, the particles slash clitics before the invariant verb, or in the case of Tok Pisin, after. But clearly the same thing qualitatively happened to create Sranang as created Tok Pisin. They're the same process. They're products of the same process to an extent that leaves the burden of proof upon somebody to explain to us why we're supposed to suppose that Tok Pisin came from a pidgin, but somehow Sranang came from something called feature selection or some sort of elaborate mixture or series of cascades, as de Graaf and Abo put it. Why the difference? What justifies the difference? Now, Mufwene has said in a rare explicit address of this, structural similarities between expanded pidgins and Creoles reflect the fact that they were developed largely by linguistic adults interacting regularly among themselves using materials from typologically related European and/or substrate languages to meet diverse and complex communicative needs. As I've said before, it seems to me that what Mufwene is saying is that yes, they developed in the same way. There are a lot of big words here, but there's no explanation here of why we should consider them to be the products of different processes, especially if what he describes is two things coming from the same process. So, it's been proven that Creoles don't come from pidgins. I'm afraid not on the basis of a paragraph like this one. 4. The Uniformitarians partly justify their confidence that Creoles don't come from pidgins on an idea that it's been proven that plantation Creoles actually emerged from approximations of approximations via waves of slaves arriving in plantation colonies. This is an idea originated by Robert Charançon in a very interesting Francophone literature that Mufwene basically continued in Anglophone form and has since developed upon. And the idea is that Creoles began as small farms were expanded into large plantations, such that new waves of slaves learned from older ones and gradually transformed the European language into a new one. Now, of course, under this idea, there was no pidginization involved. It was just transformation of degrees of mixture, the feature selection that we've talked about. But Mufwene, in particular, assumes in his work that this approximations of approximations idea is canon. He cites it. He implies that no one has ever had anything to say about it. Frankly, there is something we could almost call dishonesty here, because there are arguments that have long existed, presented by me 20 years ago now, that directly contradict this approximations of approximations argument. Namely, in one Creole after another, the evidence confirms that the Creole existed long before there were any large plantations. So, for example, Martinique Creole French already existed in the 1660s on small farms. Sranang existed in the 1660s on small farms. Louisiana Creole French existed in the mid-1700s already when the farms were, you fill in the blank. The Gulf of Guinea Creole Portugueses were created within marriages. So this is pretty intimate. There's no approximation between two people living in a house. And what was around them were small farms. Now, if Salikoku Mufwene has some reason to suppose that all the analysis that I presented is incorrect, that's great. But I would assume that he would have published it. But instead, the Uniformitarians go around claiming that it's been just disproven that Creoles come from pidgins, partly on the basis of the supposedly canonical status of this approximations idea, when in fact, Mufwene's response to McWhorter 1998, which was a lengthy article and has been reprinted, particularly pages 145 to 56 in McWhorter 2005, the response has been nothing whatsoever. Nothing. Finally, there's a point that Mufwene has been making in more recent work, which is that he claims that Creoles can't have come from pidgins because in descriptions of interactions between Europeans and indigenous people in locations where Creoles formed, what you see is interpreters rather than people using pidgins. However, you have to wonder whether by interpreter these people meant what we mean today in thinking about people working at the United Nations. Interpreters, we might even intuit in these settings, were people who knew enough of these languages to allow people to communicate. We would guess that, and the sources actually confirm it over and over again. Here, I can only give you a few cases, but Peter Bacher has unearthed these, and they make it quite obvious that there were pidgin versions of language being used in these settings, even if the people were described as being interpreters. And so, for example, there are two white men in one source who are known for speaking Ojibwe well, which might lead you to think they were actually speaking Ojibwe. But there's actually relatively copious data of the speech they were using, and it was pidginized. Or there are Native Americans described in one of the key sources on Pidgin Inuktitut as interpreters, and we have ample data in what they were using. It was Pidgin Inuktitut. In China, people described as interpreters were communicating with whites in what we know was pidginized, not full English or Portuguese. In the Pacific Northwest, people were called interpreters who were using our friend, the obvious pidgin, Chinook jargon. This is also true in the Africanist literature. And so, in sources, and this is especially ones over about the past 10 years where you'll see this, where Mufwene claims that it's been disproven that Creoles come from pidgins by the fact that there are these references to interpreters, you have to realize that he's not actually engaging the literature on this in the way that you might think. That literature conclusively refutes what he's said. So, just remember, he's not engaging the sources that I just showed you in the last slide. So here's where we are. What are we really talking about? The idea is that it's been disproven that Haitian came from a stark break in transmission. But we have to remember what Haitian is. Haitian Creole lacks French's grammatical gender, its contextual inflection, its paradigmatic inflection in general, its partitive marking, its heterogeneous word order, its liaison, its location verb, except in interrogative sentences, and so very much more. And yet we're being told that Haitian arose from French in the same way as French arose from Latin. I frankly get the feeling that a lot of you, hearing talks making claims like this, know that this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I get the feeling that a lot of you feel like you're supposed to pretend that it does, but really, let's take the facts as what they are. Is this really something that happens under normal language change? I think it's obvious that it doesn't. Now, what will often be brought up, and this is in, for example, Abo and de Graaf, although it's not the only thing they bring up, or in conference sessions, is that we have to remember that Haitian Creole, after all, has various forms, various allomorphs of the definite article. And so you can see them here. You've got la, a, and then you've got na and a. Okay, that is a particular complication that you do not see in French, and you certainly don't see it in Fongbe either. It's often shown through this, supposedly, that there is no reason to think of Haitian Creole as in any way simplified compared to French, in any way as a simplification of French than French was from Latin. But there are two things here. One, notice that this is a matter of regular phonological conditioning. Okay, it's there, it's interesting in itself, but this is phonological conditioning. This is not random paradigmatic variation of the kind that we're talking about in French. This is not, in terms of mental processing, in terms of how it works, in terms of grammatical complexity, a replacement for the nature of grammatical gender and how it's marked in French and all of the irregularities involved. I think we all know that. And more to the point, the second point is, here's this, now what else? This is often brought up, and I often say during the question session, what else? And to the extent that it can be difficult to come up with that else, I think we're arriving at a certain truth. Now, Michel de Graaf has given a list of complexities in Haitian Creole that he claims basically show that there's no reason to talk about it as being less X, Y, or Z than French or Fongbe, but that list is highly forced. It's mostly things like this, and it in no way matches the things that I gave you in the last slide. I'll be discussing that more in my upcoming book on these questions. But very often you're just given this as if it answers the question. It doesn't. So, in sum, any uniformitarian work you read that ignores the Polinquero challenge, pretends that there have been counterexamples to the Creole prototype, implies that Creole exceptionalist work is invalid in not being written in Chomskyese, and claims that a connection between pidgins and Creoles has been disproven, has deprived you of the evidence necessary to decide whether Creoles are a kind of language and whether Creole studies should exist. And I will add that this is also true of uniformitarian work that addresses these issues only in passing. It's time that in Creole studies, issues that are considered controversial or that make people a little bit uncomfortable are nevertheless granted the same basic level of intelligent engagement as all of the other ideas in Creole studies and in linguistics are. And until that happens, any claims that it's been shown that Creoles are not a kind of language, or more specifically for our lesson today, that Creoles don't come from pidgins, is dead in the water. See you next week.